I think I finally, kind of wrapped my head around the way I wanted to talk about this album after repeat listens. I don't think that it's a record that I want to talk about from the conventional reviewer headspace. It's definitely a record that I want to talk about on a bit of a micro scale. Because musically, you've all heard me say that this is probably my least favorite Kendrick Lamar record. And that isn't to say that the music here is done at a significantly worse degree than everything else that he's put out, but just to say that generally, when we are considering this record, the content within these songs trumps any type of musicality for me personally. I don't think that the weight and the intensity of these records is matched with production, and I'm not saying that makes the album bad, but it gets me to hyper focus on what he's saying more than anything that's going on in the background. And I think that's also a beautiful thing about Kendrick Lamar, is how captivating he is lyrically. Just that alone grabs the attention of the average listener. Going through Kendrick Lamar's records, I see so much of the things that I was raised around. I see the adolescence of an individual who is starting to understand his own purpose and thinks that he knows his own trajectory. So he feeds into his own thoughts about himself for a while until he comes into the understanding that this world is bigger than me, and I'm beginning to understand the things that this world is doing to myself and people that look like me. There's only so much you can do with that information as a young individual without the guidance to really tackle those subjects. Even without the guidance, Kendrick still makes it clear that on his own, he's extremely insightful, he's extremely sensitive, and extremely empathetic. I've lost probably years of my life already worrying about the condition of those around me as opposed to the things that I actually have to deal with on my own. Sometimes that occurs, but on top of having to deal with the community issues, people's expectation of you, financial stresses, realizing your own trauma but not necessarily understanding what it's done to you and how it affects you in the present day is just a lot. Listening to these records and these moments in context, Good Kid, Mad City, To Pimp a Butterfly, Damn, Mr. Morale and the Big Stepper, it just seems like they all go through their own natural order. Kendrick essentially getting a grip on the place that he's from, transitioning that information into a record where it appears as though he has a grasp on what's affecting and breaking down his community without addressing it necessarily on a micro scale, but having enough insight to at least have arguments and some level of discourse about it on a few levels below skin surface on To Pimp a Butterfly. And that isn't to diss or insult any of the content that's on To Pimp a Butterfly. It's still one of my favorite Kendrick records. It's just to say that I don't think Kendrick understood that he was one of the people that he needed to save on To Pimp a Butterfly. I don't think Kendrick Lamar realized it at that time. And so when he goes through the pressures of Damn, another one of my favorite Kendrick Lamar records, it appears as though he feels this overwhelming sense of guilt, not only because of the lack of change that he's seen in the community, but also the survivor's guilt. Why is it that I've been allowed to break free from the shackles of the traumas that affect us all, but these people aren't? And when I try to instruct, when I try to give advice, or when I try to give some level of insight, it appears as though no one's listening. That's why a good deal of the records off of Damn are Kendrick trying to break down his past and his present in a way that doesn't include as many people as it did on To Pimp a Butterfly. I feel like Damn is more so Kendrick offering himself as the dissection piece, saying that maybe my understanding of the things that we are going through should first begin by addressing myself. But he only went into this record with his own knowledge, with no tools or guidance from a professional or someone who's at least been through it that can advise him. And I feel like this is the stage that most people are at. Maybe not financially well off to receive that level of insight from another individual who most people would consider a professional. Maybe being too stubborn to trust anyone else to properly diagnose your trauma or advise you on the things that you should do. So you do your best to self-medicate. You do your best to self-educate with what you have available. And it should not be done through a rap album. It should not be done through entertainment. That level of insight and therapy can never be attained through a musical or an entertainment lens. Regardless of how much it may help an individual cope, it's not the way. And we can see Kendrick breaking down from the pressures of his own savior complex and this overall lack of satisfaction with your ability to properly diagnose and self-medicate. So he takes years off, doesn't say anything. He says he's going months and months without his phone. He finally breaks the shackles. He finally humbles himself. Listening to a record off of this album like Father Time, for example, lets us know exactly how Kendrick Lamar's father's teachings have negatively impacted his own ability to seek out help. A good deal of his discography is summed up in Father Time in addressing how I was incorrectly instructed to overlook whatever pain or trauma that I had in that exact moment to get the job done. Whether that trauma be abuse, the death of a loved one, your own fluctuating mental health, it didn't matter. You just have to keep going. Keep going until you die. Keep going until the same thing that happened to your mother that you were forced to work through happens to you, so your son has to go through the same thing. Keep doing it over and over and over again, because that is our culture. Personally, I feel like this album for Kendrick is deeper than baptism, because he's not leaving these sins and these traumas behind. He's looking at them after he cleanses himself of them and addressing them one by one. It's more than just being saved or being cleansed. It's a dissection. And the beautiful thing about dissection is it is an objective look into what makes a thing a thing. The good, the bad, the functional, the dysfunctional, the uneven, the non-symmetrical. And this is something that oftentimes gets glossed over when it comes to people in their relationship with religion. As it pertains to the Black community, your relationship and understanding of your God is oftentimes prioritized over your relationship and understanding of yourself. And with no hesitation, Black people just fed to the church immediately in their infancy with no understanding or concept of what it is or how they should use it to better support themselves. Just pray, go to church, tithe, and that's it. This is something that off of this record, I'm glad did not plague it as deeply as it did Kendrick Lamar's earlier work, because even Kendrick has a realization that probably affected his own self-view. So that's essentially where we continue with this record, is Kendrick Lamar approaching music with this newfound information, which is why we get him questioning all the different ways in life he used to be brought up in. Holes being poked in ideas, these cross-examinations, so to speak, of everything that made him who he was. It's an opportunity for him to aggressively and confidently attack the things that made him who he thought he had to be. Though, as I've said before, this is not my favorite Kendrick record from a musical perspective, and even some of the songs off of this record don't really impact me in the way that I think they do a good deal of the people who love this record. Some of those records being tracks like Rich Spirit, Purple Hearts. I can appreciate how Kendrick is addressing all of these traumas that plague our communities on such a large scale and breaking them down to their most minute little details, even going as far as to show how ugly an argument can become in a typical Black relationship, and how without any closure, without any redemption, without any understanding of why we feel these things toward one another as men and as women, sex is so easily used as a remedy or a band-aid to the deeper issue, to the root cause of whatever is starting this toxicity in our relationship, so that we can do this long enough to have a broken family of our own once we eventually have a kid, because you're gonna get pregnant. And I'm, again, just a man who's been raised by his father, who told me not to address any of my own personal trauma. So when I have a son, we can do the same thing over and over again. Fear of repetition is a big thing that I've taken away from this album, because so many of these tracks in their scenarios end up leading young Black people to the same fate. Kendrick either straight up refers to or infers cancel culture on various tracks on this album. One track where he expounds on the subject in its most detail, though, is on the track Savior, where he's essentially challenging the audience to be objective in their view of themselves. And while I think this track could do with a bit more nuance and understanding how certain perspectives are harmful to certain demographics and why the public generally challenges those opinions so strongly and so harshly oftentimes, I do still think it's important for people to take away from this track that Kendrick has challenged himself to acknowledge the ugliest parts of his being as a whole. This album is about accepting and dealing with the person you evolved from. In the beginning, Kendrick says to his audience that he Cole, Future, LeBron may have made you feel something, but that is all that you should essentially take away from that encounter. The pedestal that they have been upheld to is essentially why the fall is so hard for them once they do something that people have a disdain for. He wants people to acknowledge the caliber of individual that he is most likely closest to. Despite how analytical and insightful many may appear to be about black culture through the online space, they oftentimes don't have that person-to-person interaction with the everyday black person, which Kendrick is trying to allude is far closer to Kodak Black than they are to, I don't know, Christ. That isn't to say that Kendrick agrees with everything that Kodak does, or that isn't to say that Kendrick is supporting every action of every controversial individual that's in the public eye. It's to say that if you've ever had any expectation of me based off of a feeling that I've given you at some point, you should levy that and understand exactly how we work. If I am as huge of a person as you've made me to be, and I'm acknowledging on this record how little of my own trauma I've addressed throughout the years and how it's essentially made me a figure that I am on this album trying so desperately to distance myself from, imagine the everyday person that you would walk by that you have no idea about. And when these opinions are so harshly thrown at someone like a Kodak or any other rapper or public figure that has a troubled past, you're probably only a few notches away from talking about the average black person that has trauma similar. That doesn't mean you're either Kodak or the best black person that you can think of in history. It's to say there is an in-between or an average to be addressed, an average to be assessed. And Kendrick wants that person to be the highlight for this record, not whoever you think he is or whoever you would want humanity to be. Regardless, we will still once again address Kodak being on the record and his presence somewhat diminishing the intent of Kendrick Lamar's point or message throughout the record. Just to say this song is to levy expectations. I remember how many people went at Kendrick Lamar a few years ago when they thought he was absent to the George Floyd protests. And once it was found out that he was in attendance for those protests, there were no apologies, but at the same time, I do want to address how his presence didn't do anything near what people thought it was going to do. So once again, address how these things need to be tackled on a micro scale to expect a major change. And I said this back when the criticism for Kendrick Lamar was at a high of people assuming he wasn't in attendance for those protests, but this song reinforces that idea by letting you know that Kendrick, in that moment when he did attend those protests, was no different from the average, was no different from the everyday black individual. He had no more or no less power than anyone else that was also marching in those protests. He would have run the same risks, he would have walked the same distance, he would have screamed the same chants, and still had no more leverage in the situation. But that expectation still exists. It would not be Kendrick's job or any black person's job to address the abuse that black people have suffered from the law. I know we all heard about what happened in Texas, right? Tragic. I saw the creator of a show titled Abbott Elementary detail her experience in being told to make a trauma story about a recent situation that had occurred because it was somehow her responsibility to deal with a national, a political, a governmental problem that's been in existence for generations. It's now the responsibility of a black entertainer. This track is more than just Kendrick dropping the savior complex. This track is about how the nation, white and black people, expect black entertainers who admit their lack of qualification in these areas to address problems that even our own government has yet to do, and how they've tricked people into believing that a rap song will do more good for people in the inner city than actual systemic change, or how a TV show is supposed to do more for change than the Senate. But again, if you understand the context of these Kendrick Lamar records, you'll understand why, although I do think some of it is self-imposed, he experienced this natural rejection to the savior complex. And for a while, listening to songs like this where it seemed so obvious that Kendrick was audibly upset with the listeners that had put him on this high of a pedestal, he also kind of goes into the emotional toll that it had on him by detailing how people love you when your methods and your actions are beneficial to them. However, when your actions don't necessarily fall in line, they begin to develop amnesia. This difference of opinion that Kendrick alludes to all throughout the album can also be interpreted as him now representing himself as a flawed human being. I do think this album is very prophetic in that it almost tells the story of how people will react to Kendrick Lamar not necessarily falling in line or going with the status quo in every instance. It almost predicts that throughout some of the lyrics on the song. For me, Mother I Sober is probably the heaviest track on this album, and Kendrick's delivery is very reminiscent a child who is afraid to tell his guardian about something that happened to him only after he was questioned about it. To understand Mother I Sober, you have to also contextualize tracks like Father Time, where Kendrick is being told continuously to overlook his trauma, where he's told over and over again that no one has time to address the bad things that happen to a young black male. And so when we're listening to Mother I Sober, we're hearing the effects of a father who tells his son that these things are not important enough for you to focus on. At the same time, Kendrick on this song is trying to assess that trauma without the aid of the things that he dissects throughout this record, without the distractions of buying expensive things, chains, cars, homes. One of my favorite lines off of Silent Hill being "Peekaboo, can't hide behind your money, dog." And another thing I don't think ends up getting addressed is how easily Kendrick's own trauma is put to the side to address the trauma in the state of the black community on records like To Pimp a Butterfly and somewhat to an extent on Damn. I feel like this track is even a reference back to You, where Kendrick Lamar talks in a very expressive, angry, heartfelt, hurt delivery. But a central theme of that track is how Kendrick very closely marries himself to that bottle of liquor, marries himself to the alcohol in order to get through understanding how he felt in that moment about himself. But here, when he's met with having to face those things without the crutches of whatever he's been using throughout his life to cope with those experiences, his delivery transitions from extremely expressive, angry, flamboyant to timid, reserved, almost fearful of the thing that he's acknowledging. As a piece, I think this is probably Kendrick Lamar's best written track almost ever. It details and connects the album in a way that I don't think any other track does. And while this melancholic backdrop doesn't make it easy to return to or even digest 1 to 10 times of listening, it connects the pretty cringy, in my opinion, yet still eye-opening admission of feeling guilty for fucking white women on worldwide steppers by addressing how this experience, this abuse that he suffered as a young boy, made him chase manhood on tour. Another big track off of this record being Auntie Diaries, and how Kendrick detests anything that could be deemed as homosexual. That chase for manhood not just being an attraction to women, but a disgust for anything that could be interpreted as non-masculine or feminine. See, I can't speak for other communities, but I do know for a young black male to undergo any kind of sexual violence at the hands of another, any male in general in that regard, even if you are the victim to something like that, you are looked at as weak. And to avoid seeming weak, not only to himself, but even disappointment probably to his own father, he ignores that side, that experience, and falls into a routine where he's constantly having sex with women to reaffirm his own manhood. A cycle that leads him into a toxic relationship with his woman, one where he argues with her over and over and over, back and forth on We Cry Together. And what do? They have sex. Sex is the solution. Sex is the answer. Kendrick in the third verse of Mother I Sober acknowledges his addiction to sex, but this addiction comes in response to his avoidance of trauma. And in my head, I can only rationalize Kendrick including Kodak on the album to say that he's caused similar pain to a black woman that Kodak might have, due to not only Kendrick's addiction to sex, but Kodak's likely addiction as well. But again, we'll get into that at a later point. This avoidance ended up leading Kendrick down a path where he ultimately hurt his wife, hurt the woman that he's been with for I don't know how many years. Mother I Sober recontextualizes almost every record off of this album, and I fully understand and empathize with why it is almost the final track on the record, because it's a track that you need to build into. It's not something that you can get just right off the bat. This track also acts as a plea to the public to give every other artist who isn't looked at as favorably as Kendrick Lamar is, knowing the person that he explains himself and exposes himself as on this record. This is also a plea for you to look at those rappers, those entertainers with the same courtesy that you give Kendrick. That veil that the people have given him over the years for being a insightful, almost cultural critic. He wants that same courtesy given to them. I will challenge that request with the want to become better, the want to address your own trauma and your own sins and your own way of life has to become a precedence first. It isn't something that Kendrick can exclaim on behalf of another person. Not every artist that Kendrick is advocating for has taken themselves to task as he has on this record to be quote unquote forgiven. And to request that level of courtesy be given unprovoked on behalf of people who aren't even asking for it can easily and understandably put a sour taste in Kendrick Lamar's listeners' mouths. Though I do empathize with Kendrick Lamar wanting the everyday individual to react to these transgressions from these artists that we see, or these public figures that do these either questionable or almost perceived as non-forgivable acts with a level of sympathy due to their likely past, I don't think it's accompanied with enough of a conversation about the people that are affected by these actions. I don't think it highlights the damage done to those individuals who are mature enough, insightful enough, and courageous enough to tackle those demons earlier than many of the entertainers that Kendrick Lamar is advocating for. I don't think those people end up getting acknowledged on this record almost at all. The ones who end up getting hurt but don't hurt others, the ones who end up getting traumatized and don't put that trauma onto others, the ones who break those cycles before they end up getting into the public eye. I know Kendrick is advocating for the average, the most likely scenario, the one that you're most likely to see, which I don't think he's necessarily wrong for. I just think it's a bit unintentionally dismissive. And speaking of unintentional, we have the track Auntie Diaries, which for the last time is another very insightful track detailing how the black community especially demonizes any potential interpretable male femininity whilst easily accepting any form of female masculinity, which is why Kendrick kind of easily sets up a dichotomy between the way his cousin is treated versus the way his uncle is treated. It talks about his understanding at the time of these things and his own cousin's social transition. And here's where I'm almost ready to conclude my thoughts on the entirety of the record. Kendrick Lamar on this track makes it apparent that this is not the best way to understand or grow your perspective of gay or trans people. But just as I said about Kendrick linking himself closer to Kodak, this is the average experience. This is the most likely scenario, especially in the hood, especially in the inner city. This is the most likely understanding of these communities that you are going to have. Not the most ideal, but the most likely. And I think that is Kendrick's main point, is that the picture of the average black person that social media has created is not the same black person that Kendrick Lamar is advocating for on the album. The black people that Kendrick is advocating for are those who need this deep rehabilitation, this deep reformation of thinking, this deep reconstruction. And while they are undergoing said journey, Kendrick wants them to be looked at with an eye of sympathy or with an eye of slight understanding. Kendrick, once again, isn't just trying to say that he is human. He's not just trying to say that he's black. He's trying to say that I am deeply flawed to a point where the people who have hailed my music to such a high regard over the years are the same people that I believe would separate me from their social circles based off of the beliefs that I've held thus far. Seeing the way people have addressed the people that Kendrick may look at himself as somewhat close to has probably given him a disdain and a bit of distance from the listeners of his own music and made him feel as though if you wouldn't accept this person, you probably wouldn't accept me either. I don't think Kendrick just looks at the criticism of these other people and says, oh, well, you need to be more sympathetic. I think he genuinely gets a bit offended. But this is where my questions for the record come into play. Because while I empathize with Kendrick and I empathize with the message that he's trying to convey. I think this type of song creation piggybacks off of what was wrong with Kendrick Lamar on Damn. What was wrong with Kendrick Lamar that led him to the decisions artistically that he made from To Pimp a Butterfly to Damn? And those decisions, in my opinion, are tackling more than a rap song is supposed to chew. I don't doubt Kendrick Lamar's lyrical ability. I don't doubt Kendrick Lamar's insight. I definitely think after making a record like this, he's proven that he is extremely empathetic and considerate. However, at its core, we have Kendrick Lamar at a place of acknowledgement. He's already done the work. He's already working towards those steps of rehabilitation for himself. And it may be presumptuous of me to assume this, but based off of the way the album is structured, it would seem as though Kendrick Lamar is a sober man talking at the end of this album, speaking on behalf of those that are still in that addiction phase, instructing everyone who has a gleam of doubt about these people's intentions to just simply understand and look through a veil of sympathy. Kendrick, to me, sometimes on this record only puts the perpetrators of these questionable acts under this protective layer almost. And I think it sets up a dangerous precedence where someone could claim victimhood in response to trauma that they cause on others. Kendrick has to speak for Kendrick. And even on a record where he is being his most transparent and his most open, I still don't feel he's able to fully allow himself to be the centerpiece. He and himself only. Because when it is just him, I think the messaging on this record is fantastic. But when others come into play, when others come into the mix, it dampens that message. It dampens those ideas because they didn't ask to be there. They didn't ask to be forgiven. They didn't ask to be looked at from a sympathetic point of view. It would have been slightly different, I'm sure, if an example like XXXTentacion were used throughout the record as someone who at least seemed to be aware of the damages that he had done publicly and seemed at least somewhat open to changing the narrative that had already been established for him by him. That isn't the case with almost any of the names and people that Kendrick Lamar so openly references on this album, from R. Kelly to Kodak Black. There is no doubt that hurt people, but what about the people they hurt? In a society where these things happen at a massive rate, I don't think it's unreasonable to prioritize the safety and the therapy of those that are affected by the perpetrators of said crimes. And I get to Kendrick's point that he's saying the perpetrators are or were at some point victims to the same things that they're doing. But I think rather than idolize this utopian almost idea that Kendrick is trying to promote in this record, we can be mature enough and progressive enough as a society to rehabilitate those individuals that have committed these atrocities while at the same time holding them accountable for some sense of closure to the new victims that they create. I think both of those things can happen at the same time. And Kendrick, in my opinion, doesn't offer that perspective of accountability for the people he advocates for the people that he places on this record in a narrative position. At most, the lens that Kendrick Lamar is talking about these artists from is if they've already had everything stripped and taken away from them. And again, not to say that their trauma does not matter. It is to say that the effect that they've had on people is likely to cause significantly more damage than any type of social criticism of these artists' public image. At the end of the day, Kodak Black did what he did, and the repercussions for what he did landed him on a Kendrick Lamar album. Not to say that I agree with prison as rehabilitation, but just to say even after doing something that likely caused significant trauma to an underage girl at the time, the biggest consequence for Kodak was a Kendrick Lamar feature. Kendrick talks about the guilt that he felt at not being able to help his mother when he saw her being attacked when he was young. Am I to believe that that want or that urge to protect and defend your own family is all of a sudden dissipated because you want Kodak Black recontextualized for the sake of this record? And this is another reason why I've stopped giving review scores to albums, because oftentimes it does such a huge disservice trying to even equate a number to the value of a thing or a value of something so subjective. I'm really more interested in what it is that this album is going to end up doing. And just like Kendrick Lamar's fears on To Pimp a Butterfly and his frustrations with the lack of change and evolution socially that happened post To Pimp a Butterfly, I fail to see how making a song about trans people helps the perception to those that were already open about trans people. I don't see this Auntie Diaries record being played for someone who is already discriminatory towards trans or gay folks, and it changing their mind or their perspective into, oh, I kind of see your point, Kendrick. Is the potential there? Of course, I cannot deny that. But in the same way that I don't feel Kendrick Lamar is the first artist to make trauma dissection popular, and it's something that I strongly believe was presented to him. I mean, he admits that various times throughout this record. It very much feels like he's catching up. And if this record were for Kendrick and only Kendrick, I think I would be completely fine with that. But I think some of the arguments that Kendrick addresses in the album make it far more inclusive than I think he intended. I don't see how you detail the experiences that your mother went through and talk about the level of guilt you felt at your inability to help her in those moments while still advocating for a Kodak Black placement on this album. And while I understand Kendrick Lamar's cultural criticism of what he might deem to be cancel culture takes from people who don't interact with the average when it comes to Black people in the inner city, I also feel Kendrick's perspective on this is very far removed, because no rational person in their right mind would respond to a victim of violence in this way with, oh, well, it also happened to him. Only as an onlooker, only from the outside looking in, only from very far away could you be this detailed about your analysis of an individual who had just committed such atrocities. Because your instinct, your first reaction is to be empathetic and sympathetic to the victim of said action, not to analyze why this situation happened or why it occurred. So while I do understand Kendrick's cultural criticism, once again, he's under the same guise of criticism, in my opinion, as the people he's accusing of not fully comprehending or understanding the average Black experience. He's taken that emotional attachment out of the perspective when it comes to certain situations I see for the sake of creating music. And that's where some of that messaging to me gets lost. I could never see an artist do something as atrocious as some of the things that the public has highlighted that some of these artists have done and think about why they did it. Of course, there should be an understanding of why they did it, but the average person is going to respond with, I wonder how the victim's feeling. That person needs to be held accountable, because certain things can only be addressed when you are far away enough from the thing that you are highlighting. This happening to a relative of Kendrick Lamar likely wouldn't deem this level of introspection, which is why he details the guilt he felt on Mother I Sober as opposed to the enlightenment that he gets from highlighting Kodak Black in his quote-unquote objectivity. There are so many parts to this record that I respect as an introspective individual, someone who spends a lot of time analyzing themselves at their core, dissecting themselves. But I respect this album far more than I enjoy it. And I don't think Kendrick has put this album out for it to be enjoyed in the same lens that his previous works have been. It's meant to be uncomfortable. It's meant to be raw. It's meant to be real. I think it's another conversation to be had about how these types of experiences are too easily accessible under the guise of entertainment. But I just can't shake the feeling that this record will ultimately have the exact same impact on Kendrick Lamar that To Pimp a Butterfly did, and that it likely won't bring about any societal distance between where we are now and where Kendrick wants us to be. The difference here is that Kendrick Lamar has resigned himself from feeling guilt or feeling the weight or the burden of having to progress society as a whole on his own, which I think is great for Kendrick. But there are so many new jars that he dips his hands into on this record that I feel won't end up progressing even just in terms of conversation. Because for the most part, I feel like majority of the talking points that Kendrick Lamar goes into on this record, people have been having discourse about for years already. And again, it's something that I can respect on a mainstream level. Like on a mainstream level, no one outside of Kendrick is going to talk about these things to this high of a degree, to this level. I feel like this record is genuinely made for people who are already in that place, which is great if you just want more music, another song to add to your playlist, or some additional Kendrick Lamar bars to dissect. But are we transitioning people who've never had these conversations or this discourse before into understanding these things in a new light? I don't think so. And is that Kendrick Lamar's job? No. But to address his fan base really quickly, for those who are given the excuse that some of these songs that are a bit more offensive, some of these songs that are a bit more dark are opening the door for massive conversation, I'm sad to tell you they are not. The majority of the discourse that I see around majority of these songs that are a bit more controversial are Kendrick Lamar's fans defending his intent when creating these records, not necessarily having a discourse about the content within them and how we can alter our feelings about these things to progress as a society. So once again, I do respect this album, and I would still consider Kendrick Lamar extremely brave as an artist, and I'm glad he's no longer feeling the weight or the guilt, the responsibility to any of his audience. I'm honest enough to tell you that a lot of the content on this record very, very strongly applies to me. And listening to that be, what I'm about to say might sound like a diss at Kendrick, and it's not. Listening to that be kind of thrown back in my face musically is too uncomfortable for me to derive pleasure from what I feel the bulk of the content on this album is. And this has happened to me with records before, where the listening experience was a bit uncomfortable, but there are too many parts of me that scream out when listening to this record, I don't want this to be a song. For Kendrick, I love that this record was cathartic for him and that he released those demons, and that it seems as that he's moved past a lot of his past, and I can't do anything more than root him on. Y'all hop in the comment box and let me know how you felt about this record a few weeks after its release. I am spent, and y'all have a beautiful day, man.